You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. And do be warned, I have terrible allergies this week. Nevertheless, I think we have a pretty damn strong show for you in celebration of Black History Month, which in itself is as inane an idea as is Women's History Month or Native History Month or any month condescendingly acknowledging the existence of a group other than white men, European American males, who do not need to have a history month of their own because they have, in fact, the entire bloody year. Anyway, let's make the most of what we've got for the moment and celebrate by examining some different aspects, like the way in which our society, women especially, have been taught to sanctify a particular gynecologist who was literally a Dr. Mengele for black women. At the heart of today's episode is the crucially important Pape study out of the University of Chicago, scrupulously researched, delineating who actually constitutes the far right in this country. It will shock you. It's a stunning lesson in forelash, which, you may recall, is a word I've coined to note the warnings we do not necessarily heed about what otherwise will shortly be visited upon us in our ignorance. Backlash. But before we explore any of that, we need to go inside the headlines. On January 6, 2021, the United States experienced an act of domestic political violence unprecedented in U.S. history since the Civil War. A violent mob of 2,000 Americans, as estimated by law enforcement, breached the American Capitol to prevent the certification of Joe Biden as President of the United States. Many thousands also battled with police outside the Capitol that day. There were lethal casualties, as well as numerous injuries. Dr. Robert Pape, P-A-P-E, professor of political science at the University of Chicago and director of the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats. That's CPOST is the shorthand for the name of that. He assembled a team of scholars to work on an in-depth analysis of the Americans who have been charged for their part in this insurrection. As of January 1st, 2022, 716 individuals have been charged with illegally entering the Capitol or Capitol grounds on January 6th. Of these, 215, 30%, have been charged with acts of actual or threatened physical violence. Analyzing information related to these arrests is the best method to assess just who were the insurrectionists. The Pape analysis is grounded in detailed data and is easily available online in all of its shocking precision. You can just Google the title, American Face of Insurrection, or you can look up Dr. Robert Pape, P-A-P-E, Ph.D., Professor of Political Science, University of Chicago. Also, he is the director of the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats, shorthanded as CPOST, and you can write to them for it as well. It's available, it's downloadable, it's free. So, the Pape analysis is grounded in detailed data. And the data is drawn from a comprehensive, rigorous review of documentary evidence on the 716 individuals in the database, and from thousands of formal court documents, media coverage, and public records. Based on this review, the group systematically identified and collected a broad spectrum of demographic and socioeconomic characteristics as well as militant group ties and military experience. The data is quite remarkable for its completeness, essential for reliable analysis. For one thing, it compares differentials between violent insurrectionists, nonviolent insurrectionists, militia groups, and right-wing extremists. I urge listeners to get it and study it, because here I'm able to offer only sample findings, but the full study itself is vitally important. In answering the key questions, here are some data samples. The insurrectionists closely reflect the U.S. electorate on most socioeconomic variables, and hence come from the mainstream, not just the fringe of society. This is crucial, because this phenomenon cannot fully be built without community support, and so it needs that connection with community. Violent and nonviolent offenders are not that much different and have roughly the same prior criminal background and militant group affiliation. Perpetrators come from 45 states, plus the District of Columbia, with more coming from counties won by Joe Biden than by Donald Trump. The key county characteristic is that the counties with insurrectionists lost the most non-Hispanic white population. The full report has in-depth analysis on who among the insurgents were white-collar, who blue-collar, who unemployed or who retired, who are of college age or had done military service. Here are a few more of the shockers. Right-wing extremists are by far the youngest group, with 61% younger than 35, and with 28% under 25, making this group largely driven by millennials. The insurrectionists are middle-aged, with nearly 50% falling between ages 35 and 55, and only 9% under 25. Now, while the insurrection was able to draw in a bit more of Gen X than the right-wing violent offenders, both groups were noticeably younger than the U.S. electorate, and even more surprisingly, younger than 2020 Trump voters. Even more noticeable and startling is the lack of individuals over 55 participating in the insurrectionist and extreme right-wing movement, comprising 15% and 12% of the movements, respectively. The different age distribution tells us two important things about the insurrection as a broader movement. First, that the movement is led by millennials and Gen X, with aging baby boomers well represented in the electorate staying out. Second, baby boomers are not leaving the Republican Party altogether, as nearly half of Trump voters are over 55. They just aren't participating in the brand of American right-wing movement, this brand. Additional eye-openers on gender and sex and race demonstrate that both right-wing extremists and insurrectionists are predominantly male and white, especially when compared to the 2020 U.S. electorate. Among those arrested for right-wing extremism between 2015 and 2020, 94% were white and 94% were male. In the period of the insurrection, 93% of perpetrators were white and 85% were male. While Trump voters in 2020 were also predominantly white, 84%, the males or female ratios remain uniquely unbalanced for insurrectionists and right-wing extremists. The insurrectionists have white-collar and blue-collar profiles similar to the electorate and to Trump voters in 2020, indicative of the movement's mainstream appeal. The unemployment status of the insurrectionists differs from that of previous right-wing extremists and appears in line with January 2021 rates of the larger electorate and 2020 Trump voters. Insurrectionists had a similarly low unemployment rate at 7% compared to 2020 U.S. voters and 2020 Trump voters. This is a stark contrast to the trends among previous right-wing extremists. As for education, well, 25% of the insurrectionists have a 4-year college degree. Only 1% are high school dropouts, lower than the electorate and certainly much lower than right-wing extremists. The college rate closely resembles the percentages of the electorate and Trump voters as a whole, and is far higher than the rate of college education among right-wing extremist defenders. 15% of the insurrectionists had some military experience, and while this seems higher than the broad U.S. population at 10% and 2020 Trump voters at 13%, it's comparable to the broader population when it takes into account that the insurrectionists are predominantly male. Then there's militia membership. Far fewer insurrectionists belonged to militias when compared to right-wing extremist arrests between 2015 and 2020. 48%, almost half, of right-wing extremist arrests in those years belonged to a militia or group, while only 13% of insurrectionists in 2021 belonged to a militia or group. The greatest difference between right-wing extremists between 2015 and 2020 and the insurrectionists lies in the number of unaffiliated perpetrators. 86% of insurrectionists had no known affiliation to a militant group or gang, compared to only 48% of violent right-wing extremist offenders. This difference demonstrates how the insurrection as a political movement evolved without the leadership of an extreme group and attracted individuals who are not necessarily extremists. This doesn't absolve the role that militias played in the insurrection. The data show a strikingly high percentage of right-wing extremists, 64% having a prior criminal record. In contrast, only 30% of the insurrectionists had some prior criminal record. However, both the insurrectionists and right-wing extremists had a notably higher percentage of criminal records than U.S. voters or Trump voters at 20% each. In sum, violent insurrectionists are not that different from the rest of us. If anything, the presence of these violent streaks within the larger insurrection further demonstrates the transition of radical right-wing ideology from the fringe into the mainstream. Overwhelmingly male and white, more likely to have prior or active military service or affiliations with militias, slightly younger, less educated. While the rates of high school dropouts remain comparable between violent and nonviolent offenders, rates of college degrees are lower for violent offenders. Much more likely to have a prior criminal record, prior violent charges, and prior incarceration. An aside here. The team did not analyze prior violent charges, but I would wager anything that they include a high rate of domestic violence. 4-lash. When employed, they are more likely to be business owners than nonviolent offenders, are and less likely to be white-collar, blue-collar, or self-employed workers. As to geographical distribution, violent offenders are not clustered, suggesting that the same process is mobilizing insurrectionists overall and also mobilizing those who engaged in violent offenses. While it would first appear that violent offenders are clustered in Texas and Florida, and 25% of them did come from those two states alone, those are also the home of similar amounts of nonviolent offenders. Here are some other final coup de grace takeaways to last you until you can access the report itself. CPost considers about 21 million people who comprise the so-called stolen election movement. Of those, 48%, almost half, are driven by the Great Replacement Index. That is the "you will not replace us" chant that you heard in Charlottesville or at Trump rallies or at the Capitol, demonizing in particular black people, secondarily all people of color, although there's enough rage apparently to spread it around at others: Jews, women, Democrats, same-sex lovers, books they don't like, etc. Of that 25 million, 56% are motivated by the Great Replacement Index and by QAnon, which also has followers who blend vaguely into end-of-days devotees, and 64% is motivated by the Great Replacement theory and QAnon and other, which is primarily racial. Indeed, racial resentment hovers around 60% as the motivator, the prime motivator for these people. News sources for the 21 million are also surprising. Traditional media are more prevalent than social media, with 42% following right-wing sources: Fox, Newsmax, One America News. 32% follow CNN, NPR, newspapers, and the networks. 20% follow Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and 10% follow social media of more extreme sorts like Parler and 4chan and 8kun. In other words, mainstream news media, at least of the right, is much more important than social media in the insurrectionist movement. Perhaps the problem isn't with Trump. Perhaps the problem looks back to Rupert Murdoch. The growth potential among the 21 million reveals that 18 million of them have access to Internet organization tools. 8 million own guns. 6 million support the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys. 4 million have prior military experience. 2 million attended protests in the past 12 months, and 1 million are militia members or know of one. Here's another shocker. They come primarily from metro areas. 73% who would restore Trump by force come from cities. Only 27% come from rural areas. 70% think Biden is an illegitimate president, whereas only 30% of rural residents agree. The overall finding, well, Great Replacement fear is the most single important driver of the insurrectionist movement, and that in turn breaks down into race fear. We are still fighting the Civil War, and there's nothing civil about it. We have to take our first break here, but there's lots coming up, and right around the bend is a hilarious and also sobering Surrealism Corner. Subscribe to this program on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. Follow us on Twitter at WMC Live, like our Facebook page at facebook.com/WMC Live, and visit us at WMCLive.com for more information about our show and our guests.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Don't you just know that if we're going to look into stuff white people like, we must be in the Surrealism Corner. The title, Stuff White People Like, A Definitive Guide to the Unique Taste of Millions, is obviously designed to provoke. The book began life as a conversation over instant messenger between Christian Lander, who is white, and a friend who's Filipino, about the HBO television series The Wire. His friend said he didn't trust any white people who didn't watch the show. The two then began to wonder what white people were doing instead of watching the show. Yoga, the friend suggested. Seeing plays, Lander countered. Getting divorced. Therapy. Lander thought this conversation would be a funny idea for a blog. Well, it turned out to be a very popular one. The website, Stuff White People Like, soon attracted about 300,000 hits a day. It's still up and still attracting. The list ballooned to include organic food, fair trade coffee, indie music, Apple products, and vintage T-shirts, presumably worn with irony. It must be noted that when NPR was added, some of the folks who work there got a little bit miffed. So I went to the website and laughed out loud and took it as a jumping-off place to expand on some of its concepts and add some of my own. Here are some of my thoughts. Stuff white people like. TED Talks. One of the easiest ways to create something that white people will like is to create something that will allow them to feel smart but doesn't require a large amount of work, time, or effort. There is a catch, however. Whatever it is that you create cannot be a shortcut. You see, white people like the idea of getting smarter quickly, but they don't like the idea of people thinking they're lazy. Due to the broad audience watching the talks, TED speakers generally take very complex ideas and boil them into simple, engaging presentations. So when a white person finds out that you have a PhD and attempts to engage you in a conversation about string theory, you should know that all of their understanding comes from a 20-minute talk that they listen to while running on a treadmill. You should also be aware that the average white person considers their knowledge on the subject to be on par or superior to yours. Sadly, TED Talks are not all roses and NPR-approved comedians. For many white people, TED conferences are actually a source of sadness and depression. This comes from their dreams to attend a future TED conference in person. But with a price tag of $6,000 and an invite-only policy, many white people are simply unable to attend. This is a new concept for white people, as they have successfully been creating and joining expensive, exclusive clubs for over 1,000 years. Popular examples include private schools, politics, and ice hockey. Full disclosure, I did a TED Talk. That must make me very white. Other ideas. Farmers markets. Yeah, white people, that's among the stuff they really like. Black music that black people don't listen to anymore. Camping. Picking their own fruit. Ah, yes, going out into the apple orchards or the pumpkin fields once a year. Religions their parents do not belong to. That's highly popular among white people. Film festivals. Big, big, big attendance. Diversity, especially as it relates to restaurants. Yoga. Yoga for dogs, otherwise known as doga. Even better than yoga. White people like Pilates. Having black friends, that's a big hit. Also, not having black friends. That's actually a very big hit, too. They're kind of neck and neck. And celebrating Kwanzaa, even if they have no idea when it is. Well, that's just a sampling. You can get more on their website. And remember when I mentioned earlier that I laughed out loud? Well, I would now like to add that that's something apparently white people do. They laugh out loud at this list loudly. And that, of course, is quite surreal. We have to take another break right here, but I'll be back directly with some fighting words. The Women's Media Center, founded in 2005 by Jane Fonda, Gloria Steinem, and myself, is a progressive, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to make women visible and powerful in media. You can learn more about the WMC at womensmediacenter.com.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
To expose a medical predator is a good use for fighting words. I'm indebted to the writer J.C. Hallman for the details below from his superb article in The Forum, a publication of the African American Policy Forum founded by Kimberly Crenshaw, who has been a guest on this program. I've touched on this particular subject before, but never in quite the following detail. It's the story of women victimized by the so-called father of gynecology, J. Marion Sims. As Hallman writes, Sims enjoyed an unquestioned reputation as a path-breaking researcher and experimenter in American medicine. His actual career, built on gruesome experimental surgeries performed on enslaved women without anesthesia, was doubly insulated from serious public scrutiny. First, he benefited from a culture of impunity that dehumanized black women on grounds of both gender and race. Then, as a pivotal figure in the professionalization of American medicine, he claimed uncontested patriarchal authority to abridge the basic Hippocratic oath and canons of Western medicine in the service of the scientific inquiry that would eventually enable routine medical atrocities. This meant that his medical reputation was near unassailable until very recently. After the infamous 2017 Unite the Right march of white nationalists in Charlottesville, Virginia, protesters and counter-protesters feuded over a statue of Robert E. Lee. A week later, 1 week, 4 women in East Harlem, waiting for no one, put on bloody hospital gowns for a picture taken in front of a statue of Sims that had stood in New York for 130 years. The picture, the image, went viral. The Sims monument was removed 8 months later, even before the Lee statue was finally taken down. Although Sims had many critics in his own lifetime, by the early 20th century, a vast campaign of sanctifying him via laudatory articles by doctors from all over the country silenced his critics. This image makeover paralleled the rise of apartheid Jim Crow regimes in the American South. Sims had opened Women's Hospital in New York in 1855 with the express purpose of founding a larger version of his backyard, quote, Negro hospital, close quote, in Alabama. He wanted to monetize his procedure for the so-called cure of vesicovaginal fistula, which he had performed in years of experiments on black enslaved women in downtown Montgomery. The new hospital would create a venue for additional experiments, plus those to be conducted on Irish immigrant women who, though not enslaved, were another vulnerable population, having recently fled Ireland's Great Famine on so-called coffin ships. Sims ran the new hospital for 6 years, left for Europe during the Civil War, returned in 1868, and didn't perform surgery again at Women's Hospital until 1872. Well, a lot had changed, and Sims was highly displeased. Prior to the Civil War, the Women's Hospital Board of Lady Managers, as it was called, had been mostly a ceremonial board, easily manipulated by Sims. But now some of the ladies, emboldened by battlefield medical experiences, became more assertive. They initiated an investigation into growing mortality rates at the hospital, and they enforced rules about the number of visitors invited to observe vaginal surgeries. Sims' second tenure at Women's Hospital lasted 2 years, ending with a confrontation at an organizational gala in 1874. It was a study of mortality rates that got him ejected from his own hospital. The lady managers had concluded that he was killing too many women. Still, his expulsion became a national scandal, because by then he was world famous. The American Medical Association elected him then to the presidency in an election that even his worshipful biographers were forced to acknowledge amounted to the male medical establishment's critique of the female managers at Women's Hospital. Sims gave speeches against medical ethics, which he described as an engine of torture, victimizing innovative physicians. He built his reputation in the service of fame, money, and the erection of more Sims statues in Alabama and in South Carolina. The first stirrings of reappraisal began in the late 1960s, with dissertations that turned into books by such scholars as G.J. Barker Benfield and by Deborah Kuhn McGregor, who took aim at the matricide committed by these newly named gynecologists who, all male, had ejected women from practicing midwifery. Then, in 2007, Harriet Washington's award-winning book, Medical Apartheid, documented a long history of medical experiments on African Americans. People finally noticed. In East Harlem, a woman named Viola Plummer, inspired by the book, began handing out flyers questioning the presence of a statue that had gone unnoticed for decades on the outer wall of Central Park. A group called East Harlem Preservation took up the cause, and soon was joined with community organizations calling for removal of the monument. Women marched up Fifth Avenue chanting, "Say her name, Anarcha. Say her name, Betsy. Say her name, Lucy." References to Sims' earliest experimental subjects. New York's initial response was to delay, spread lies, and express bemusement. Activists forced a public meeting to which Harriet Washington was notably not invited. Years of stalemate followed. J.C. Holman began researching Sims in 2015, setting out to find hard evidence of the existence and later life of Anarcha, the most consequential of Sims' experimental victims. And he was eventually able to recreate most of her life story, using primary source documents to track her movement from the Montgomery plantation, where she was born, to the lonely forest in Virginia, where she's buried. The toxic nature of the Sims story became apparent as soon as he began his research. The New York Academy of Medicine, among other organizations, indulged in cover-up about Sims' 1857 prestigious annual address, even though, in 1870, he was tried and convicted by the Academy's Special Committee on Ethical Violations. Nonetheless, after he died, the Academy played a role in the erection of his statue. The stalemate persisted until 2017, when Confederate monuments began to fall across the South. Holman's work revealed that Sims had acted as a spy in Paris on behalf of the Confederacy during the Civil War. But by then, that damning information was no longer needed to convict him in the court of public opinion. Mayor Bill de Blasio created a special commission to reconsider the city's policy on public art of all kinds. With the 2018 de-installation of the Sims Monument, New York took an unprecedented step in metropolitan history. A statue could now be removed because of public concerns over the person or the values it represented. This left the country's elite medical institutions in quite a bind. Sims had served terms as president of the AMA and the American Gynecological Association, and had been a founder and officer of the Medical Association of the state of Alabama. Less than a month after the removal of the Sims monument in New York, the Medical Association of the state of Alabama issued a half-hearted, sorry not sorry statement on Sims. This foot-dragging proceduralism is characteristic of the efforts of high-profile institutions to dodge accountability and owning up to an ugly racial past. As becomes absolutely clear in these controversies about monuments, they represent values, not history. In the medical world, the learning curve on these issues remains frighteningly steep. In 2021, the American Medical Association became embroiled in scandal when its official publication, the Journal of the AMA, JAMA, released a podcast and supporting tweet suggesting that structural racism was impossible in healthcare. At precisely the same moment, another wing of the AMA was preparing to release a 3-year strategic plan to address racial justice and advance health equity. In 2020, the American Gynecological Society published its own benign yet factually challenged statement, claiming that Sims' experiments had led to, quote, successful treatment of vesicovaginal fistula, close quote. This conveniently ignores multiple fistula cures that predated Sims and also skirts the specifics of his method, which was challenged and abandoned only 4 years after he published it. More to the point, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists in 2021 followed with a substantive suggestion to rectify the ugly legacies of Sims and proposed that the dates of February 28th to March 1st be dedicated to Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, and state measures endorsing Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy Days have since passed in Connecticut and in Alabama. Among the efforts to honor them has been Michelle Browder's Mothers of Gynecology Monument, erected in Montgomery in September of 2021. And this year, Browder's More Up Campus will host an inaugural Day of Reckoning conference on Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy Days. Long past due. J.C. Hallman has authored 6 books. His new book, Anarcha, will be published by Holt in 2023. Those are my fighting words. Add yours, and remember to tag us at WMC Live and use the hashtag #FightingWords. And that's our show for this week. We'll be on hiatus next week, but the week after that, we'll be right back here. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and now Instagram at @TheRobinMorgan, and you can check out my blog at robinmorgan.net and find my latest book of poems, Dark Matter, and my brand new novel, Parallax, wherever books are sold. Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily represent the Women's Media Center. Here's the family for Women's Media Center Live. Executive producer as well as founding and sustaining sponsor, Regina K. Scully. WMC president and co-executive producer of this program, Julie Burton. I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us. Join us again next time on Women's Media Center Live.